They wanted him out, and now he's gone. He was one of the most revolutionary education secretaries of recent years, or one of the most destructive and divisive, dependent on your point of view. Safe to say the leaving card from many teachers would be better left blank. Deborah Kidd is about to leave teaching, a profession she says has been destroyed by Mr. Gove.
I think the marketisation of schools has created a fragmented system. I think the morale of teachers has plummeted. I think children have been treated as units of data being pushed towards exam results, and we've lost sight of the child as a human being.
Who was your favourite teacher and why?
My favourite teacher was a man called Mr. Duncan, Mike Duncan, and he was my English teacher.
Few doubted Gove's passionate belief in the transformative power of education.
And the terrible thing is that we still write to each other. And he still writes me notes from time to time saying, that was a good idea, or I wish you hadn't said that.
But it was the method and speed of his own attempts to transform the education system that set him at loggerheads with the teaching unions. 4 of them ended up passing a vote of no confidence in the Education Secretary. He fast-forwarded the Academies programme and championed free schools. They could be set up by parents or charities and were free from the sort of local education control he decried.
We work in a culture of fear, not one of working together.
His critics he denounced as the blob or enemies of promise, facing them down with a steely, old-school courtesy.
If Ofsted is a cause of fear, then I'm grateful for your candour, but I'm afraid we're going to have to part company.
As the man in charge of our schools, Michael Gove often cut a contradictory figure, unfailingly polite, but unflinchingly combative, like a rather well-brought-up street fighter. Now, with less than a year to go till the next election, it looks as though his lack of popularity may have cost him a job he loved. The question is, will his legacy live on? At Sydney Russell School in Dagenham, they have the Education Secretary to thank for their expansive and well-equipped new building. One of the last projects he signed off under an old Labour policy. Neighbouring schools were not so lucky. The head here is also in charge of 3 free school projects and says while he acknowledges some failings, Mr. Gove can be judged by one thing.
I think we're now in a much more rigorous situation where students are really being pushed to achieve high academic results and compete with the best in the world. That's what this country needs.
The head here believes it's too far down the road for the loss of Mr. Gove to see his education changes undone. Others are not so sure.
Moving Michael Gove from education effectively means you want the reform agenda to stop. It was very personal with Michael Gove. He'd been preparing for this for years. He was personally doing battle, not just with the unions, but with officials in his own departments. Now, when you move him out of there, unless you replace him with another committed reformer, like Liz Truss, his former deputy, then the reform will stop. And I think it means David Cameron just wanted things to quieten down. He'd had enough fighting with the unions, and he wanted a period of peace before the general election.
Well, I'm joined now by the head here, Jacques Chmielakowski. Mr. Chmielakowski, teachers have reported on social media dancing on the tables today. How do you feel about Mr. Gove's departure?
Well, despite the fact we're in a performing arts festival this evening, we're not actually dancing. Mr. Gove, clearly a very passionate politician who, perhaps like no other Secretary of State, has raised the profile of education in this country. Unfortunately, I think there's also a precedent there of meddling in a fairly ad hoc and arbitrary way in the running of schools and the pace of reform and the ad hoc way in which they've been announced and the piecemeal implementation of those makes them very, very difficult to implement.
Now, if Mr. Gove was still here, he might call you one of the enemies of promise, part of the blob. Are you part of the blob?
No, well, I think the blob's a very pejorative term, and I think one of the difficulties has been that Mr. Gove's passion has sometimes been translated into a very singular view of what's valuable in education, what kind of qualifications are worthwhile, and indeed what subjects are worthwhile. And the blob has been used to talk about head teachers like myself, teachers, university institutions, and even Ofsted has had a spat with Mr. Gove recently. And the Performing Arts Festival we got here is actually a statement from our school's point of view that we value creativity and we value arts very, very strongly. After all, in the UK, it's a powerhouse of our economy, and that's been marginalised by some of Mr Gove's reforms.
So do you think, though, that it was actually rather the way he did things rather than what he did that most enraged the teachers?
Absolutely. I think the way in which he did things, sometimes announcing things on political programmes on a Sunday morning and so on, is not the way to run education policy or to run an education service. I also think where there were some detailed consultations, for example, around speaking and listening in English, where everybody disagreed with the removal of that, that was then ignored. So clearly we're looking forward to some consultation and listening to the profession, who after all work every day with children in schools.
I mean, the point is that Mr Gove would say he had to come in, be revolutionary, be really radical, because he was fighting against forces who were just not willing to change, who had had a stronghold on education, in his view, for too long, and that we performed very badly, actually, if you look at the statistics, compared with other parts of the world.
That's not strictly true, and it depends how you interpret those statistics. For example, the PISA tables, some countries like Singapore are now looking at how they can perform in terms of the softer skills that our country is so good at, and they're looking to the UK on how we develop
But
that.
you hear
So
business
team
all the
building
time
and working.
saying that our children are not capable of going into work.
Well, if you look at the last CBI report from last year, that was very, very clear about the need in schools to learn teamwork, students working with each other, cooperation, creativity, problem solving. And that's not me speaking, that was a CBI report from last year, which goes against the grain of some of the reforms that he was implementing.
Very briefly, what do you hope happens now?
A period of stability and consultation and consolidation.
Jackson Malachowski, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Christian.